For 17 years, Command Sergeant Major Theodore Aldrich had not spoken a single word. Not at his daughter's wedding. Not at his wife's funeral. Not when his granddaughter was born and placed in his arms in a hospital room in Savannah, and cried the way newborns cry, loud and furious and alive, and he had only pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling until his eyes cleared. The finest military neurologists in the country had reviewed his case. 2 teams at Walter Reed, a specialist at the Mayo Clinic, a program at Johns Hopkins that cost his daughter Lee 4 months of savings, and 2 months of fighting the VA for reimbursement. Every one of them had delivered the same verdict in slightly different language. The blast trauma from the IED outside Kandahar in 2008 had damaged his Broca's area beyond functional recovery. The silence was permanent. Theodore Aldrich, who had commanded 300 Rangers through 2 combat deployments, who had never needed a radio to make himself heard across a firefight, would spend the rest of his life without a voice. His daughter had stopped believing that. 17 years was a long time to believe something that hadn't changed, but she had not stopped trying. If you're new here, welcome to Hidden Badges Stories, the channel where we tell the stories of the people who carry what they never talk about. Subscribe if you haven't already, tell me what city or state you're watching from, and if you want more stories like this one, the like button helps more than you'd think. Now, back to Atlanta. Mara Doyle did not stand at the nurse's station, she moved. By 7:40 on a Tuesday morning in March, she had already recalibrated the CPAP settings on the patient in room 11, talked a resident out of ordering the wrong contrast agent for a scan in Bay 3, and replaced a faulty IV pump the overnight shift had been too tired to notice was alarming every 4 minutes. Her scrubs were the color of deep water, a vivid teal that caught the overhead fluorescence and held them. She wore her dark hair, shot through with a few early threads of silver at the temples, in a low braid at the base of her neck. A small pin was clipped above her name badge, dull silver, the shape of an open hand, fingers together, thumb out. The way a medic signals all clear in low light, nobody had ever asked what it meant. Her left forearm, the one she rested on the chart rail when she was thinking, carried a burn scar running from wrist to elbow, old, flat, the kind that takes years to stop pulling at the skin around it. She was 38. She had worked the neurology floor at Meridian General for 6 years. By the official record, she was a registered nurse with a bachelor's from Georgia State and a prior career in Army logistics. That was not entirely true. The family in Bay 9 had arrived at 7:15. Mara had seen them through the glass when she passed. A woman in her mid-30s, dark circles under calm eyes, standing very straight the way people stand when they've been holding themselves together for a very long time. A man beside her, younger in a Georgia Tech hoodie, touching the back of his own neck without seeming to know he was doing it, and in the wheelchair between them, a man. Large, even seated, even diminished, you could see it. The breadth of the shoulders, the way the neck still sat on them, square, held. He wore a gray button-down, collar open, cuffs rolled once. His hands rested on the armrests with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with stillness and everything to do with control. He was managing himself. Had been for 17 years. Mara stopped at the glass. Below his left ear, just behind the jawline where the mastoid bone angles into the neck, she saw it. A scar. Small, almost nothing. A thin curved line, maybe an inch, following the natural crease of the skin so precisely that any examining physician would look once and move on. Mara had not moved on from a scar like that in 11 years. She pushed the door open. "Good morning, I'm Mara Doyle, I'll be your intake nurse today." The woman looked up. Leigh Aldrich. Her handshake was firm. "This is my husband, Owen. And this is my father, Command Sergeant Major Theodore Aldrich, United States Army, retired." Mara didn't let her face do anything. She had been trained in places where your face doing something could get someone killed. "It's an honor, Sergeant Major." The man in the wheelchair looked at her. Dark eyes, very still, the face of someone who had watched people for 40 years and stopped being surprised by most of what he saw. He gave her a single nod. That was all he could give her. Lee kept talking, filling the silence that belonged to the person who couldn't fill it herself. Walter Reed, Emory's neurology department, a specialist at Penn, 17 years of the same answer in different offices. But a colleague at Emory had mentioned a new attending here, Dr. Harmon, who'd published on cortical language pathway recovery. They'd waited 5 months for this appointment. Mara was watching Theodore's neck. "May I take your vitals, Sergeant Major?" He nodded. She wrapped the cuff, placed the stethoscope, 68, 126/80. Cool, dry skin, hands that hadn't shaken in this room yet, though the husband's had. Then gently she asked to check his lymph nodes, and he tilted his head, and she moved her fingertips along the angle of his jaw, and she felt it. Under the skin behind his left ear, just beneath the scar, a small ridge. Hard, maybe 3 millimeters, the size of a grain of rice, the kind of subcutaneous marker no civilian surgeon had ever placed there. Mara pressed her fingertips back to the chart rail. "Sergeant Major," she said quietly, "did you receive any field procedures after the blast, before the medevac?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly he lifted his right hand off the armrest and tapped his own neck twice, once with 2 fingers, just below the scar. Mara closed her eyes for half a second, opened them. "Thank you, sir." Behind her the door opened, and Dr. Jeffrey Harmon walked in. 61, silver-haired, the kind of tall that had once been athletic and had since become simply large. He wore his white coat with the ease of a man who'd worn it long enough that it felt like skin. He didn't greet the family. He picked up the chart from the wall mount, read for 30 seconds, closed it. "Mr. Aldrich." Lee's chin lifted half an inch. "Sergeant Major Aldrich, doctor." Harmon glanced at her. "I've reviewed the imaging and the prior assessments. I'll be direct, since that's what you've been waiting 5 months for. The damage profile is consistent with what 4 other institutions have documented. Severe Broca's area lesion, additional compromise to the arcuate fasciculus. The language network is structurally disrupted at multiple points. There's no surgical intervention and no therapeutic protocol that reverses this kind of damage at this stage. I'm sorry." Lee's hand went to her father's shoulder. "Doctor, we were told you'd published on pathway recovery. Early intervention cases. Within 18 months of injury. Your father's injury is 17 years old. The cortex has reorganized around the damage. There's nothing left to work with." He handed the chart back toward Mara without looking at her. "Discharge. Refer them to the speech-language outpatient program for augmentative communication options." Mara didn't take the chart, she didn't answer. The room went quiet. Lee's hand stayed on her father's shoulder. Owen had gone pale. Theodore was looking at the floor, with the particular stillness of a man who'd been dismissed before and had learned, somewhere in 17 years, to simply take it. That stillness was the thing that broke something loose in Mara Doyle. "Dr. Harmon." Her voice was level. He was already turning toward the door. "May I have a moment with you in the hallway?" It wasn't a question. It had the shape of one and the weight of something else. Harmon turned back, gave her the brief recalibration men like him give nurses who speak without being asked to. A small, tight smile. "Whitlock, I don't take clinical direction from Doyle," she said, "and I'm asking for 1 minute in the hall." The sergeant major lifted his eyes from the floor, watching her face with the look of a man who recognized something. The particular quiet of a person who'd learned to be invisible on purpose. Harmon stepped into the corridor, Mara followed, and let the door close. "Make this brief." Mara kept her hands loose at her sides. She'd learned a long time ago not to cross her arms with someone she needed to actually hear her. The scar behind Sergeant Major Aldrich's left ear is a field mastoid access incision. It's the approach used for emergency cochlear vagal pathway bridging in blast-related neural trauma. The procedure was developed by a joint DARPA and SOCOM medical research team between 2006 and 2011. It was classified until 2019. It's never appeared in civilian neurology literature, because the program that produced it was shut down before publication. Harmon stared at her. "The bridge doesn't repair damaged cortex. It doesn't touch Broca's area. It establishes a low-amplitude parallel conduction pathway along the vagus nerve that bypasses the damaged arcuate fasciculus and routes language signal through the right hemisphere's compensatory speech network. In theory, and I've seen it in practice, it keeps that network primed, available, waiting for the right stimulation to bring it back online." "What are you talking about?" "I'm saying his cortex may not have reorganized around dead tissue. It may have been waiting for 17 years for someone who knows what's under that scar to give it a signal it can use." Harmon's jaw worked. "Doyle, you'll go back in that room, assist the family with discharge, and come to my office at noon. You and I are going to have a very short conversation about scope of practice." Mara turned and opened the door to Bay 9. She crossed the room, crouched so her face was level with Theodore's, her burn-scared arm resting on the chair. She didn't touch him yet. "Sergeant Major." Her voice was very quiet. "I need to examine the area behind your ear and assess your throat. I'm not going to make you any promises. I haven't done this in 11 years, and I'll be honest with you about every part of it. But I think the medic who worked on you after that blast may have done something no doctor in 17 years has known to look for. I'd like your permission to find out." He looked at her a long time, at the pin above her badge, at the scar on her arm. He was a man who'd spent 40 years reading the difference between people who said things and people who meant them. He lifted his chin a quarter inch and nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." He hadn't said it. He couldn't. But Lee, standing behind the wheelchair, put her hand over her mouth, because her father hadn't used a military courtesy nod in 11 years. He'd stopped somewhere along the way, because it felt like a lie, addressing someone as if he were still the man he used to be. The door hissed open. Harmon was back. "Doyle, I've spoken with the charge nurse. You're being reassigned to." I'm going to perform a brief neurological assessment, Mara said. With the Sergeant Major's full consent, it'll take 8 minutes. You will do no such thing. We want her to. Lee's voice was quiet and clear. We drove 4 hours. We've been doing this for 17 years. This is the first time anyone in a white coat has done anything other than use different words to tell us the same thing. She can have 8 minutes. Harmon opened his mouth. The Sergeant Major wasn't looking at him. He was watching Mara open the supply cabinet on the far wall. She took out a pen light, a long-handled otoscope, and then, from the bottom of her bag, unzipped an inner pocket and removed a flat gray case the size of a deck of cards, sealed with a strip of surgical tape. The tape was dated 2019, the year she'd left the program. She'd carried the case in the bottom of her bag for 6 years, restocked it twice, never opened it at work. She set it on the rolling tray. What is that? Harmon had stepped closer. A vibrotactile neural interface. 8 contact points, throat and mastoid placement, manual frequency control. It generates a low-amplitude oscillation pattern. The bridge implant is designed to receive and amplify into the right hemisphere speech network. That is not FDA-approved equipment. The protocol was declassified 4 years ago. The equipment was never prohibited. It was simply never known. She broke the tape. Inside padded in gray foam were 8 adhesive contact pads, each the size of a nickel, wired to a central hub the size of a thumb drive. 1 dial, 2 buttons. 1 to set frequency, 1 to send the pulse. Lee made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Owen took half a step back, then stopped himself. Harmon stepped forward. I'm calling security. You can do that, but first I want you to see something. She turned to the Sergeant Major. Sir, I need to place 1 contact point behind your ear, over the scar. I'll press it gently and ask you to hum. Not speak, just hum, whatever comes. Theodore looked at his daughter. Lee nodded. He looked back at Mara and nodded too. She placed the pad, cold adhesive. She pressed it once gently over the rice grain ridge beneath the skin. And Theodore Aldrich hummed. It wasn't a strong sound. Thin, slightly cracked, the sound of a mechanism that hadn't been used intentionally in 17 years. But it was deliberate, controlled. A low note he could start and stop. He stopped. Looked at his hand on the armrest, fingers trembling very slightly, the way a hand trembles when it's been clenched a long time and finally lets go. Lee made a sound that was definitely not a word. The sound a person makes when something they'd stopped believing in appears in front of them under fluorescent lights, on linoleum. Harmon hadn't moved. His tablet was in his hand and he'd forgotten it was there. What just happened? The bridge received a mechanical stimulus, Mara said. The vibration activated the implant, which amplified the signal along the vagal pathway into the right hemisphere. He just produced a voluntary vocalization for the first time in 17 years. She kept her voice clinical, her hands still. Doctor, this is not his ceiling, this is his floor. She turned back to Theodore. Sir, I'm going to place all 8 contacts. 4 on the throat, 4 along the mastoid and jaw. I'll set the hub to the lowest frequency and step up. You may feel warmth or a vibration like a phone buzzing in your jaw. If anything hurts, raise your left hand and I stop immediately. He raised his left hand halfway to show he understood, then set it back down. It took 4 minutes to place all 8 contacts. Lee helped with the ones at the back of the neck, her fingers no longer shaking, because somewhere in those 4 minutes she decided she wasn't going to. Owen stood with his back against the wall and breathed. Harmon did not leave. Mara set the dial to 1, pressed the button. Theodore's jaw tightened. His throat moved. A sound. Not a hum this time, a syllable, the front of his mouth opening around something that might have been a vowel. Owen's hand went to his mouth. 2, Mara said, to no one in particular, and moved the dial, pressed the button. And Theodore Aldrich said 1 word. It was rough, abraded, broken at the edges, a sound locked behind 17 years of disuse. But it was a word. Lee. His daughter's name in a voice she hadn't heard since she was 17, and he was leaving for his 2nd deployment. Lee didn't move for 3 full seconds. Then she sat down on the floor of Bay 9, her back against the exam table, her knees up, her face in her hands, crying the way people cry when they've spent a long time not crying in medical offices. Owen slid down the wall beside her, arm around her, saying nothing. Theodore looked at his own hands. His jaw kept working, trying, the sound still broken, a man remembering how to do something his brain had been told was gone. But signal was moving where for 17 years there'd been silence. He looked up at Mara, didn't speak. She looked back. What did you just do? Harmon said very quietly. I activated the bridge. The pathway's been there the whole time. It was just waiting for the right frequency. She paused. If you want to be in this room for the next hour, you're going to see the rest of it. If you want to call security, that's your right. I'm going to finish this assessment either way. Harmon looked at her a long moment, at Lee on the floor, at Owen, at Theodore, testing his own teeth with his tongue like a man checking something he thought was broken. He walked to the far wall and stood there, arms at his sides. He did not call security. By 9:30 that morning, Theodore Aldrich had spoken 11 words, not all complete, several approximations, the right syllable structure around the wrong phoneme, like a key that fits but doesn't quite turn, but 11 was 11 more than 0. The speech-language pathologist on call, a woman named June who'd been doing this for 22 years and didn't rattle easily, had been pulled out of a session by a call from Harmon himself, which was unusual enough that she'd walked quickly. She stood in Bay 9 for 40 minutes, ran her own assessments, asked Theodore to try sounds in sequence, watched his right hemisphere light up on the portable FNIRS device someone had wheeled in. When she found Mara at the nurse's station, her face was careful. Doyle. The right prefrontal cortex is lighting up like a compensatory network that's been primed for years and just got a signal it could use. Yes. The usual imaging wouldn't have shown this. The bridge doesn't appear on standard MRI. There's a frequency-gated signal you'd only see on functional imaging if you were looking for it at the right band. It was in the declassified program documents. A footnote, Appendix C of the 2019 release. June was quiet then. How many? Mara looked at the legal pad beside her, where she'd been writing in pencil, not the electronic chart, not yet. The program tracked 63 soldiers who received the bridge in the field between 2007 and 2011. 41 were documented with post-injury communication deficits. The program was shut down in 2013, before the reactivation protocol was ever administered to a single one of them. June's pen went still. How many of the 41 are still alive? Last confirmed count was 2019, 26. Some have been living in silence for 15 years, 18 years. One man I know of was a school teacher before his injury. He hasn't spoken to his students, his wife, or his children in 16 years. June set her pen down, placed her hand flat on the counter, then straightened and walked back toward Bay 9. At 11, Harmon found Mara in the staff lounge, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. He came and stood beside her, and after a moment said, "Doyle, who are you?" Staff Sergeant Mara Doyle, United States Army, 75th Ranger Regiment, Combat Medic, 2007 to 2014. Attached to the Joint Neural Trauma Research Program, Fort Detrick, 2011 to 2013. Call sign Echo. She paused. I have a nursing degree from Georgia State and 6 years on this floor. That part is also true. Harmon looked at the scar on her forearm. Is that from? Yes. He nodded, looked at the window. I told that family their father was out of options. You had no reason to look for the scar. I didn't look at all. His voice had changed, the voice of a man alone with a fact about himself he didn't like. I read the chart, I read the prior assessments. I walked in and gave a family who'd driven 4 hours 20 words in the door. Mara didn't answer. What does he need now? Full speech-language therapy, intensive, daily for the first 3 months minimum. An MRI with the imaging protocol from the 2019 documents. I'll write up the parameters. A research referral to Emory's neuroplasticity group. Dr. Reyes does right hemisphere compensatory language work. And time. His network's been primed for 17 years. The runway's there. He just needs help using it. Harmon nodded slowly. And the other 25? I've been trying to figure out how to reach them for 6 years. I couldn't do it alone, no institutional standing, no access to the records. She paused. I can now. Harmon was quiet a long moment. I owe that family an apology. Yes, doctor, you do. He nodded and walked out. Mara picked up her coffee. It was the wrong temperature. She drank it anyway. The meeting that afternoon was on the 4th floor. The hospital's chief medical officer, Dr. Frances Holt, ran it with the precision of a woman who'd learned to skip preamble. Present, Harmon, Mara, the hospital attorney, the head of research, and a VA liaison called in from downtown. Holt wanted to know how Mara had the equipment. Mara told the truth. She'd retained it when she left the program, signed out under her name, declassified in 2019. No laws broken. The attorney looked at the case on the table and said nothing. The VA liaison asked if the sergeant major should be transferred to a VA facility. Lee, allowed into the room at Mara's request, said no with a quiet completeness that ended the conversation. Then Holt asked the question Mara had been waiting for. How many other veterans? 26. Last confirmed 2019. All received the bridge in combat between 2007 and 2011. All documented with post-injury communication deficits. None have ever been offered the reactivation protocol, because the program closed before it could be administered. Some have been living without speech for close to 20 years. The room went very quiet. Holt placed her hands flat on the table. Lieutenant Colonel Doyle. Staff Sergeant, Mara said. Holt paused. Staff Sergeant Doyle. Meridian General is going to establish a dedicated clinical track for identifying and treating veterans with field neural implants. You will design the protocol. You will train the team. You will run the outreach. I'd like to remain on the floor. You can remain on the floor. You're also going to run this. Those things can coexist. Mara looked at the case on the table, the strip of surgical tape still hanging off one edge. All right. 2 days later, she was at her desk on the second floor, in the small office beside the neurodiagnostics library, when her phone rang. She'd already spoken to 4 families that week: a man in Fayetteville, a woman in Baton Rouge whose brother had been mute since 2009, a family in Phoenix. She answered the 5th call. A voice she hadn't heard in 11 years said her name. She closed her eyes. Sergeant Doyle. Colonel Pace. Brigadier General Darren Pace arrived at Meridian General the following morning at 0700, DoD legal counsel in tow. Pace had aged, same jaw, same stillness, hair gone entirely gray, holding himself like a man who'd won a lot of arguments and didn't expect this one to be different. He opened a folder without looking at her yet. Staff Sergeant, you removed Department of Defense program materials when you separated in 2014. Equipment signed out under my name. Declassified in 2019. I've been over this. The implant procedure you performed on a civilian patient. On a retired veteran with full informed consent, using a legal declassified protocol within the scope of my nursing license, augmented by my prior medical training. She paused. Counselor. The attorney looked up. The program was shut down in 2013 because the funding was reallocated, not because the science was wrong, not because the protocol was unsafe, because a budget line moved, and 26 men have lived in silence ever since because the department decided the paperwork was more inconvenient than the treatment was necessary. That is what you're here to protect. The attorney's mouth closed. Pace's jaw tightened. I'm not here to relitigate 2013. No. You're here because yesterday a command sergeant major, who hasn't spoken in 17 years, said his daughter's name in a hospital in Atlanta, and by next week it'll be in every newspaper in the country, and your department is trying to get ahead of it. Pace looked at her a long time. The door opened. Holt came in. Behind her, a tall man in his 60s in a suit that didn't hide 30 years of uniform underneath, and 2 hospital attorneys. Holt didn't sit. General Pace. I've spent the last 18 hours in contact with 2 members of the Armed Services Committee, the Army Surgeon General's office, and 3 veterans advocacy organizations. Meridian General is prepared to pursue every institutional and legal avenue to defend Staff Sergeant Doyle and this work. I'd like to know if the Department of Defense is prepared to defend, in federal court, an 11-year delay in providing a documented treatment to 26 veterans injured in service to this country. Pace looked at Holt, then at the man behind her. Darren, the man said, quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be loud. Major General Thomas Wick, Army retired, looked at Pace the way senior officers look at each other when the argument is already over. Stand down, the program was wrong to close, we both know it. These are our people. Let her bring them back. Pace's jaw worked. He closed the folder, looked at Mara. I objected in 2013. I lost the argument. I know, sir. A pause. I should have lost it louder. He stood, picked up the folder, looked at Holt, then Mara, then Wick, and walked out. The attorney followed without speaking. Wick turned to Mara, came to attention, right hand rising to his temple. Mara stood and returned the salute. He nodded once and left. Holt sat down in the chair Pace had vacated, placed one hand flat on the desk. Get to work, Staff Sergeant. Mara did. Theodore began speech therapy that same week, with a therapist named Grant who'd worked with TBI patients for 15 years, 2 of them at Walter Reed. He didn't coddle the sergeant major, didn't speak slowly. He adjusted the frequency on the hub before every session, and treated Theodore exactly the way Theodore had always wanted to be treated. Like a man with a job to do who needed help doing it. By the end of the first week, Theodore could reliably produce 15 words, short ones, nouns. His daughter's name, Water. Yes, no. His wife's name, Ellen, which he said twice in a row on a Tuesday afternoon and then stopped, and Grant gave him 60 seconds and said nothing. By the end of the second week, 30 words. A sentence, fragmented, approximated, but a sentence. I am fine, not entirely true, but said with the same slight upturn at the end that Lee later told Mara had been his signature for 50 years, the particular way he said it that meant he wasn't fine, but that he was handling it. By the 4th week, Theodore Aldrich sat down across from his granddaughter, 2 years old, who had never heard her grandfather's voice, and he said her name. Mara wasn't in the room for that. She heard about it later from Lee, in the corridor outside the therapy suite, in a conversation that lasted 4 minutes, and that Mara had to excuse herself from after 3. She went to the stairwell at the end of the 3rd-floor neurology wing, and stood there a while. The other calls kept coming. Jerome from Fayetteville arrived on a Thursday. His wife Paulette had driven him 8 hours. Mute since 2009, 54 years old, the scar behind his right ear. When Mara placed the first contact pad and he felt the vibration through his jaw, he grabbed the armrest so hard his knuckles went white. Not from pain, but from a sensation in his own throat he'd stopped expecting to feel. His first sound was half a laugh, broken and rough and completely unintentional. Paulette put both hands over her face. Raymond, from Phoenix, came the week after. Former EOD staff sergeant, silent since 2010, arriving in a van his son had fitted with a ramp. The quietest patient Mara had worked with, not because he was defeated but because silence had become his native language, and he wasn't sure he wanted to give it up. He looked at the contact pads a long time, then asked, eyes on the equipment, "If it works, what happens to everything I learned to say without words?" "You keep it," Mara said, "you just get more." He nodded and let her place the pads. Not everyone could be reached. 3 of the 26 had died before Mara could contact their families. 2 were too far gone. The implants degraded past threshold, the muscle memory of vocalization too long untended. She met with each of them anyway, told them exactly what was possible and exactly what wasn't, and stayed as long as they needed. One of them, a former ranger named Dale, mute since 2008, said nothing at the end of their meeting. He reached out and gripped her hand with both of his and held it. She let him. He died 6 weeks later of causes that had nothing to do with his voice. His daughter sent Mara a card. He told me in his way for years that no one remembered what had been done to him. He died knowing that you had. That was the whole thing. That was everything. Mara kept the card in her desk drawer. On a Thursday evening in late May, she was in her office at 9 p.m., the building quiet, 3 hours into calls with 6 families, 2 program administrators, a congressional aide, and a former colleague named Petra Walsh, now running a private neurology practice in Arlington, who'd been waiting for this call since 2014. Petra drove down 2 days later with a duffel bag and 3 copies of program files she'd kept when everything else was sealed. The 2 women stood in Mara's office and looked at each other a moment. "You came back," Petra said. "I came back." They didn't embrace. They just got to work, which was its own kind of reunion. The phone rang once more that evening, an Ohio number she didn't recognize, a woman's voice, careful, trying to keep it steady. "My name is Barbara Trent. My husband is Lewis, Army, 2007. He has a scar behind his right ear and the VA told us it was nothing. I saw the news. Can you help him?" Mara checked her legal pad. "Lewis Trent, number 19 on the list, alive as of 2019, not yet reached. Yes. Can you bring him to Atlanta?" "We'll leave in the morning." "We'll be ready." She hung up, wrote the name down, underlined it, looked at the window, the parking structure lights on in long, even rows, then turned off the office light and walked home. 4 months after the morning, Mara Doyle walked into Bay 9 and saw a scar the size of a thumbnail behind an old soldier's ear. Meridian General held a gathering in the hospital auditorium. Not a press event. The press had already come and gone, 3 weeks of it in April, quieter coverage in May. A piece in JAMA in June with Mara's name at the top and Harmon's below it, which Harmon had insisted on. The auditorium held 160 people. It was full. In the front 2 rows sat 11 men. Each had arrived silent, each had a voice now, rough, partial, some nearly clear, all provisional and hard-won and real. Jerome and Paulette, Raymond and his son, Lewis and Barbara Trent, 6 others, various branches, various injuries, various years of silence ended. They wore their service uniforms, several for the first time in over a decade, 2 needing new tailoring for bodies the years had changed. All had been offered civilian clothes, all had declined. Lee sat in the 3rd row, her hand in Owen's. Behind them, Petra Walsh in a charcoal blazer, June 2 seats down, Grant beside her. At the very back of the room, Harmon stood with his hands behind his back, his white coat pressed, none of the expression he'd worn in Bay 9 4 months earlier left on his face. Holt spoke first, briefly. She introduced the program, introduced the men, and did not introduce Mara, because Mara had asked her not to. Then, Command Sergeant Major Aldrich has asked for the floor. Theodore Aldrich stood. He didn't use a cane. He walked to the lectern under his own power, which had nothing to do with his legs, which had always worked fine. What hadn't worked for 17 years was the word for each step. Now he had the words back, not all of them, enough. He gripped the sides of the lectern. "I was silent for 17 years. His voice was rough, still slightly approximated on the longer words, but unambiguously his own. "I was told by 7 physicians in 6 hospitals that the silence was permanent, that the part of my brain that held language had reorganized itself around the damage, and there was nothing left to reach." He looked up. "On a Tuesday morning in March, my daughter brought me to this hospital. A nurse named Mara Doyle came into the exam room. She did her job. She looked at me, not at the chart, at me, at the side of my neck, at something nobody had thought to look for in 17 years. And she looked like someone who recognized what she saw. He paused. In 4 months, with the work of every person in this room and many who aren't, 11 men who spent years in silence have found their voices. There are more coming. There are always more coming, and Mara is going to find them. His eyes moved across the front row, man by man, each gave him a small nod. There are 3 men we could not reach in time. I carry their names. I will carry them. He straightened. I want to thank my daughter and my son-in-law. I want to thank the therapists and the researchers and the staff of this hospital. I want to thank Dr. Jeffrey Harmon, who had the courage to stand in a room where he was wrong and stay there until he understood why. At the back, Harmon didn't move. And I want to thank one more person. A person who carried a piece of equipment in the bottom of her bag for 6 years. A person who walked into a room and saw something no one else had seen in 17 years. A person who, by the formal record of the United States military, is listed simply as a staff sergeant, medic honorably discharged. He looked across the front row again, man by man. Staff Sergeant Mara Doyle, will you come forward? Mara had been told about the presentation, not about this part. She sat still a moment, then stood. Deep teal scrubs, the open hand pin above her badge, and walked to the front, her shoes quiet on the carpet. Theodore stepped out from behind the lectern and crossed the 4 steps to her without holding anything, slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of her and brought his right hand up to his temple. In the front 2 rows, 11 men rose to their feet, some steadier than others, some with a hand on the chair beside them, and brought their hands to their temples. They held it. From the 3rd row, Lee stood, Petra stood, Grant and June stood. From the back of the auditorium, Jeffrey Harmon brought his right hand to his temple too. Imprecise, tentative, the gesture of a man who hadn't earned it through service and knew it, and offered it anyway because nothing else was adequate. Mara's throat closed. Her chin stayed level. She raised her right hand, the one with the burn scar, the one that had placed the contact pad that morning and every morning for 4 months, and returned the salute. Held it, then brought it down. The room applauded. It started quiet and built and went on. Afterward, in the corridor, coffee appearing from somewhere, people standing in clusters, someone laughing the way people laugh when the laughter is made of something that used to be tears. Theodore came to find her. I called my granddaughter this morning, he said. From the hotel. Mara looked at him. First phone call in 17 years. I said good morning. I said I love you. She's 2. She doesn't know what the words mean yet. He paused. She said it back. Mara looked toward the window at the far end of the auditorium, where the late light was coming through. Mr. Aldrich, that's all I needed to hear. He nodded once and went to find his daughter. Harmon came to her last, holding 2 cups of coffee, handing her one without asking, the first time he'd done anything for her without being asked. Black, she said. I know, I asked June. He looked at the floor. There are still names on the list you haven't reached. I know. I want to help. She looked at him. You'll need to learn the imaging protocol and the reactivation assessment. It's not difficult, but it has to be precise. I have time. Yes. The right temperature this time, so do I. She walked out of the auditorium and down the long corridor toward the elevators, past the hum of the lights, the same disinfectant smell as every other morning, Meridian General in the last light of a May afternoon. She stepped off on the 2nd floor, walked past the consultation desk toward the end of the corridor, Bay 9. A new patient inside, a man in his mid-50s, a woman beside him, hand on his arm, a son in the corner with the exhaustion of someone who'd been doing this a long time, the man in the chair looking at his own hands. Mara stopped at the door, breathed in, pushed it open. Good morning, I'm Mara Doyle. I'll be your intake nurse today.